Hi everyone, I am Jessica Fern Cooley, psychotherapist and coach in Boulder, Colorado. And today's talk, Rewire Your Triggers, is a presentation that I've been giving at different conferences this year. And the feedback that I've been getting from you all is that it has been really helpful and supportive for you in really working through and figuring out some of your own triggers as well as working out triggers in relationship. So you all have asked me if I could make it available to you. So here it is. Here we are. This talk is available to you to listen to again, to re-listen to the exercises that we will do in the second part of this presentation, and then to share it. Please feel free to share it with friends, lovers, partners, family members, anyone who you think will resonate and benefit from this kind of work. So I have been doing some version of trigger work with people for the last 12 years because I really have seen it as a basic life skill for the success and health of any relationship, whether that is with friends, coworkers, family members, definitely if you're a parent, and then undoubtedly if we are talking about intimate relationships. But then I started to work with folks practicing non-monogamy, couples practicing polyamory, and then I went poly myself. And so I really started to see how understanding our triggers and knowing how to diffuse our reactivity is a skill that is even more crucial, even more relevant when we are traversing the waters of non-monogamy. And so before going poly myself, I spent this really intensive period doing this kind of trigger work and working through my own triggers, really healing the things from the past that kept getting activated in the present in my relationships and really interfering with my relationships. And then this other part of trigger work is anchoring in our nervous system, the ability to really come from a place of connection and love and responsiveness instead of coming from fear and reactivity. And so as you can imagine, this really served me in my monogamous relationships. And then I went poly and I was really humbled. I was really surprised because suddenly now my skill alone around managing my triggers was not enough. Because in the context of just me and one other person, even if they were totally triggered, just one partner having the ability to soothe and not go into full reactivity. It's not about being perfect. We're never going to be perfect, but just not going into that full reactivity. Just one partner being able to do that is usually enough, is usually sufficient to really not get swept away in that cycle of reactivity that can happen between partners, where one partner gets triggered and they start reacting from their triggers, and the way they're reacting totally triggers the other partner, and then they start reacting in ways that re-trigger the first partner, and around we go. The cycle of reactivity, or trigger contagion is what I also call it. So when one partner has skills within a dyad, usually that is enough to circumvent this trigger contagion and have a different type of conversation together. But then, fast forward some years, my husband and I are now polyamorous, and I'm in a very close relationship with another man who is also in a marriage himself. And so one day my boyfriend gets totally triggered by something that my husband says, and his wife gets also triggered by the same thing that my husband says. And now my husband is triggered because they're triggered by him. And I quickly see that my skill alone was not sufficient, was not enough to hold down the fort and be the anchor for 4 people in the way that it was possible to do when just it was me and one other person. So in non-monogamy and polyamory, we all need more skills around our triggers, because as the number of people increases, that constellation of intimate relationships complexifies. Now that complexity for many of us is a rich and beautiful thing, right? Many people are very nourished by that complexity. But with that complexity, it can also bring with it just that many more opportunities to get triggered with each different partner, with each different metamour, with each other family member that comes along and enters the picture. And we can also get really blindsided by triggers that we didn't even know that we had. Triggers that never would have arose within the context of monogamy, but wow, they can be painfully present within the context of non-monogamy. Now, with that said, however, my experience of working with people is that our triggers can really actually be a gift. Of course, it never feels like that in the moment that we're triggered. I know that. But I also know that when we approach our triggers with curiosity and really learn how to shift into responsiveness instead of being run by our knee-jerk primitive reactivity, our triggers become this amazing opportunity to strengthen and deepen our relationship with ourselves, to strengthen and deepen our relationship with our partners. Trigger work can also be this amazing way to heal those pains from the past that keep getting imposed on the present, as well as really transform those beliefs, those outdated stories that you might still be stuck in. And so doing all of this kind of work really frees you up to start living your life and really start living your relationships based on your more preferred expressions of self, especially when it matters most, when we're triggered, when we're in conflict, when we're in tension with the people that we love. And when I say more preferred expression of self, I mean coming from this place of love and connection and choice, where you're really showing up how you want to be showing up, instead of being run by your automatic reactions. All right, and so for the rest of our time, I'm going to switch into slide mode. You should see my slides now. And so what we'll be talking about today in this intro talk is, first I'll define what I mean by being triggered. Then I'll go through the first part of my trigger model with you. And then we're going to spend the rest of the time going through a guided trigger process together. It'll be a 3-part process where you'll get to walk through a moment when you were triggered and experience different facets of it. Okay, so I define being emotionally triggered as the moments when something non-life-threatening happens that initiates a fight, flight, freeze response in your body. So millions of years of evolution have wired into us a stress response that is meant to keep us alive in life-threatening situations, where our more primitive reptilian brain structures and our emotional mammalian brain structures get fired up to either fight and defend ourselves, flee and get on out of here, or to freeze and play dead. And this has obviously been a necessary defense mechanism for our survival. But what's really interesting is that newer findings in neuroimaging and neuroscience are showing that our brains can't actually distinguish between a physical threat to our actual life versus an emotional threat, a threat to our ego, a threat to our identity, or a threat to the worldview that we are in. So in instances where maybe we think we've made a mistake, or we're worried or afraid that someone is going to judge us or criticize us or reject us, or we're just reading something or watching something on the news that challenges our values, we can actually get triggered into the fight, flight, freeze response. So in today's world, it's not so much that ferocious animal that is what's dangerous anymore, but really it can be things like your date is 15 minutes late, or someone texts you with a weird emoji, or your partner is on the couch, messaging with somebody else that they're totally in new relationship energy with, and your body can be responding in the same way as if your life was actually threatened. So being emotionally triggered is the moments when something non-life-threatening happens that initiates the fight, flight, freeze response in your body. I think it's important to say, though, that there are moments when something is actually threatening more than your ego. When someone is trying to physically or emotionally hurt you, or you're in some kind of catastrophe or accident, or because you're non-monogamous, you're experiencing discrimination at work, or you're having, legal issues around your housing or the custody of your children. Very real moments when your safety and security are being threatened. And so it makes complete sense that your entire nervous system would be in high red alert. But as you've probably already learned, that even if there is a perfectly legitimate reason to be triggered, reacting from a triggered state where you are speaking and behaving or messaging from that triggered place rarely helps the situation, if not always makes it worse. Especially when we are talking about getting triggered in intimate relationships where, you're getting defensive or nasty or shutting down and withdrawing. Over time, again and again, this can really wreck relationships. Okay, so this is the trigger model. This is the first part of it that I'll be sharing with you today. And so first we have an event. So there's something that happens, which can be internal or external. Externally, an event can be something that someone did, something that they didn't do. It can be something that somebody says, something they didn't say. It can be big as a global catastrophe that's going on, or it can be as small and subtle as just the way someone raises their eyebrow at you from across the room. Internally, an event can be our thinking, the stories that are running in our mind about ourselves, about somebody else, our thoughts about something that happened 15 years ago or something that we're anticipating next week. In and of themselves, none of these events are inherently triggering. Of course, it feels like that, but none of these events are inherently triggering. What triggers one person could easily go unnoticed by someone else and could potentially excite a third person. But what's happening here is that your nervous system is interpreting it as a problem. So there are multiple interpretations that can be made about any moment of our experience. But when we are triggered, there's really a single interpretation that's happening, and that is that there is a threat. And this is really happening at light speed. This isn't a conscious interpretation that we're making. It's happening below our conscious awareness. Because the amygdala, which is a cluster of neurons deep within our emotional brain, or the limbic system, and it's responsible for constantly scanning our environment for potential harm or danger or threat. And so when it registers something as a threat, even if it's not an actual threat to our life, but more of these emotional threats, it registers it as a threat, and it instantaneously will set off a whole cascade of internal experiences, internal changes in our somatic experience. And so I define our somatic experience as the entirety of sensations, emotions, and thoughts that occur in the mind and the body. I see the mind and body as one full system. I don't see them as separate, but I do find that with trigger work, it's important to make the distinctions within the mind and body of what are our thoughts, what are our emotions, what are our sensations, because they can all show up differently for different people and even with different triggers. So let's go through this. So the body. So usually when we get triggered, there's this intense shift of unpleasant sensations. And many of you probably know these. That rush of adrenaline and cortisol. The heart starts racing. Throat can close. There can be body tension in the jaw often, or tightness in the shoulders and chest. There can be butterflies in the stomach, sweating and flushing of heat. And then even coldness in the extremities, right? All the blood is kind of moving to the center of our body. Then emotionally, there is usually an increase, which can just be an increase of fear, anger, rage, upset, anxiety. And often with this increase in emotions, there can also be an increase in older emotional memories, which I think can be one of the most challenging aspects of getting triggered, is where there's something happening in this moment that's upsetting you, but then it's like you're getting simultaneously teleported back in time to all of these other moments from your past where you kind of felt a similar way, that resemble the situation that's currently happening. And so the reason this happens is because that amygdala that I just talked about, that's responsible for scanning for threat, it also plays a role in the storage of emotional memories. So as the amygdala gets kicked up and ignited, it will stir up all these emotional memories with it, which can make it really difficult to tease apart what is real and legitimate in this moment that I'm experiencing versus what is my own stuff coloring the present moment. Now, some people actually go down instead of up with their emotions, and there can be this decrease where there's more of a going numb, or there can be that emotionally shutting down. Now, mentally, with the mind, our higher brain functions will start to shut down. So our prefrontal cortex is the most recent part of the human brain to evolve. It's behind the forehead of your head. And this is really where the best of what we think of ourselves as humans, this is where it lives. You know, our ability as humans to think creatively, to think logically, to make decisions and problem solve, our ability as humans to have empathy and compassion, our morals, our ethics, our ability to see things from multiple perspectives, to have a sense of humor and laugh at ourselves or the situation we're in. And I think in terms of triggers, even most importantly, this is where introspection is, which is our ability to sort of tune inwardly and have a sense, a knowing of what is exactly going on for me, and then being able to articulate that. So all of the things we need most when we're triggered, they all start to shut down. They all start to go offline, and we lose full access to them. And so usually instead what happens is our thoughts will really start to shift. For some people, they begin to speed up and get really racy. They can become overly critical or judgmental. They can become very myopic or extreme, that black and white thinking. For some people, they really slow down, right, or become very clouded, and you get this kind of mushy brain, and I can't even put two thoughts together. Perceptions will also get distorted, so people can misinterpret physical gestures or facial expressions when triggered. People will easily hear things that were not said, or sometimes miss or ignore things that did happen. That's sort of that myopic, I'm only seeing things from one perspective, and even though you apologized to me 3 times, I never heard you apologize to me once, kind of thing. Okay, so we have this event. It's interpreted as a threat. At light speed, our whole internal experience really dramatically changes. And then we have an external reaction. So what I've seen, which is probably no surprise, is that we tend to fit into the fight, flight, or freeze response when we are in reaction. So with fighting, if you're not actually physically fighting somebody, it could be raising your voice or yelling, would be a version of fight, becoming argumentative, blaming and defensive, interrogating somebody, jumping to conclusions, even talking too fast. Flight can look like leaving the situation. You literally get up and go. It can be, if you don't leave, sort of pulling away and withdrawing physically. Becoming really avoidant, so not answering emails or text messages or phone calls, or someone's asking you a question from the other room and you're ignoring that you even heard it or just avoiding answering. Flight can also be the mind starts to wander, so if you're physically still in the same place, the mind can go, and people can also start to physically dissociate. And then freeze can look like losing the ability to speak or think clearly, getting really quiet or tired. So some people will actually fall asleep in the middle of conflict with a partner, which will usually drive their partner nuts, right? And really that emotionally shutting down. And so I want to point out that freeze is actually neurologically different than fight or flight. So the freeze response is our most ancient defense strategy, whereas reptiles, if something came along and was life-threatening, we would just go into immobilization and do this shutdown freeze response. But then as we evolved into mammals, we have a newer, what's called mobilization defense system, which is the fight or flight, where we are mobilized, we can physically use our body, our limbs, our voice to either get away or to fight. And so even though fight or flight can still be intense, it's actually relatively an easier place to be than freeze, because you still can move your body, there is still agency that's happening. Whereas in freeze, you're in a complete system shutdown. And a lot of times when I'm working with multiple partners, couples, is we look at when one partner is freeze, it's not the same thing than if the other partner is in fight or flight. And how do we actually tend to that? Because they need a different kind of support to sort of unlock from that freeze state. Okay, and then finally, there is a result, which is usually some kind of pain or regret. So there might now be feelings of hurt or embarrassment or being ashamed. There might be trust that needs to be rebuilt or damage that needs to be repaired. And that could be physical damage to objects that have been broken, or the emotional damage that can occur when people are reacting from a triggered place. So far I have presented this, we'll go back. So far I presented this sort of in a linear arc, right? This one person's experience that happens in 2 seconds. But really our triggers are relational. So it's more of a cycle. It's more of a circular process, right? So you say something that might be completely harmless to you. You might even think you're making a joke, but for whatever reason, it completely triggers your partner. Then the way they start reacting then triggers you, and around we go, as I talked about earlier, that cycle of reactivity or that contagion that can happen, especially as we're adding multiple partners to the mix, metamours to the mix. That contagion can spread like the plague. But of course, the purpose of sharing all of this is to emphasize that things don't have to go this way. This lower arc is usually how things go, but the cycle of reactivity can be broken. And you really can train yourself to respond skillfully instead of react habitually. And it's really well established in neuroscience now that our brains are much more plastic and changeable and malleable than we ever previously thought. And what's called self-directed neuroplasticity, which is really just a fancy way of saying using your focused attention to change the way that your brain and mind function. So through doing that, we really can train ourselves to have more access to our higher brain functions so that we can override our more primitive reactivity and really create much more empowered choices in the moments when it matters most. But of course, it does take effort, it does take practice, it does take repetition. Okay, so normally the second part of this is I talk more about the different steps to responding, how we raise our trigger awareness, what your individual trigger spectrum looks like, techniques for you to stop and soothe yourself out of fight, flight, or freeze, and then how you can connect and redirect your behaviors into a more preferred response instead of those problematic results that usually happen. However, instead of me talking and talking, I want to guide you through an experience because I think this is really what makes a difference for you all. So we're going to do a 3-part guided exercise where you're going to get to know first your reactivity, then your vulnerability, and then we're going to shift into responsiveness. And before we actually get into the process, right now I want you to pick a specific time when you were triggered in relationships. So a moment when you were triggered that you can easily point to what that triggering event was. So, someone said this, or someone did that, or I read this, or I thought this. An easy moment that you can point to that then sort of went down into the reactivity arc. Now, for the sake of the exercise right now, I'd say on the scale of 0 to 10, imagining a 0 is not being triggered at all, 10 being complete explosion or meltdown, pick something that's maybe a 3 or a 4 or a 5. It can be something that has some juice to you or for you. But I'd say, don't do the hardest, most difficult trigger the first time doing the exercise. And of course, you can go through this process again. Okay, so it's up to you. You can keep your eyes open or you can close your eyes, but either way, sort of just get comfortable. And in this first round, we're going to get to know your reactivity. And so, what we'll start with is looking at a snapshot of your internal somatic experience, and then we'll look at how you externally reacted. So, begin with just bringing to mind the moment that you got triggered. So, as best as you can, step back into what was happening. So, set the stage. Where were you? Who were you with? What was sort of happening around you in general? And then what specifically happened that was triggering you? So, as best as you can, focus on that moment when you got triggered. And then recall what sensations in your body are there. And you might be feeling these sensations now. But what happened to your body as you got triggered? So you might have felt some tension or tightness. There might be tingling or fluttering sensations. There could be hot or cold. Or even parts of your body where you don't feel anything at all. So what happened to your body? And then with that, what emotions or feelings were present? So were you angry or frustrated? Were you surprised, annoyed, scared, anxious? So just tune in now to what were the feelings, what were the emotions that were present when you got triggered? And then what did your mind start doing? So maybe your thoughts started to rev up. Maybe you got very blaming or judgmental. Maybe your mind went in the other direction where your brain or thoughts started to sort of slow down and get really fuzzy or clouded. And what stories or beliefs showed up about yourself, about others involved, about the situation? And then did your perceptions change at all? And so now that we just got a snapshot of what that internal somatic experience was for you, now I want you to see how you then went on to externally react. So after that moment of getting triggered, and your body and mind and emotions start immediately responding, how did you then start to behave? How did you start to speak or act? How did you start to move your body? So did you start to get more fight-like, or maybe you got defensive, argumentative? Maybe your body and posture started to get bigger. Or did you start to go more into flee, where you're, emotionally withdrawing or pulling your body back, leaning back even? Or was there some version of freeze of freezing up, getting tongue-tied, shutting down in some way. And sometimes we have a combination of these. It's not just one. So which of these ways did you react and how did it show up? And from this reactive self, what was your reactivity motivated by? Did it want to be right? Did it want to hide or protect or withhold? And then some people like to give a name to their reactivity. So you can just call it your reactivity, your reactive self, your triggered self. But some people like to come up with more personalized names. If that works for you, go for it. So I have a reactive self that's the Ice Queen. I have a friend that calls their reactive self the Bulldog. So if there's any sort of archetypal names that work for you or very personalized names, you can do that if it feels helpful. And then just open your eyes or sort of take a breath or two to shift out of this experience. So that was just part one. And if we were in a group setting, I would have you turn to a partner and get to share. You might be doing this with a partner, so you can pause this and take that time, or you can even write down and journal or take some notes of just how did your reactive self express itself? And what did you learn from that? What did you see? So next what we want to do is move to the second part, which is exploring what is behind or beneath this reactivity. So we do this first by working with your reactivity a bit more so that we then have better access to the vulnerable self that this reactivity is protecting in some way. So what I'm going to have you do is recall how you reacted again, but then this time in the safety of your visualization, you're going to fully express your reactivity. So you're going to fully allow yourself to do the thing that you never actually got to do or wouldn't be possible even to do, right? You're going to fully air it out, so to speak. And there's actual logic behind this. So when we are in the stress response, there we go. When we're in the stress response, our nervous system expects to go through a complete cycle where there is that threat. Our body gets to then physically address the threat by either escaping it, fighting it and disabling it, or freezing, but then we unlock from that freeze and then we return to homeostasis and we move on. So there's a beginning, a middle, and end to the whole cycle. But today, as modern humans, this cycle gets interrupted because we have socialized ourselves out of fully expressing the mobilizing experience, that second part, that mobilizing experience that our body actually wants to have when we're triggered. And this is one of the theories on trauma. It's that it's the lack of completion of this cycle is what keeps that repetition, right? That continuous cycling and replaying of the memories or the experience that someone went through that can happen when there's trauma or PTSD. So what we need to do is have strategies for discharging our triggers and completing the stress cycle, right? So I'm not going to ask you when I work with everyone in person, I don't ask them to get up and physically do it. Instead, we get to use one of sort of those hijacks of our brain, which is that our brain does not know the difference between something that we visualize versus something that we're physically doing. So in the safety of your visualization, of your imagination, you can actually complete this cycle and bring yourself back to homeostasis. Okay, and then after that, we get to explore what is the vulnerability. So this is, connecting with what is being threatened, right? What is the core of the trigger experience here? So if we're seeing our reactivity as what's happening in response to our nervous system interpreting a threat, then we need to identify and connect with what exactly is being threatened. So the reactivity in many ways is just a symptom. Now, it's important that we tend to that symptom, right? We don't just leave the symptoms there. Then we need to take it a step further and inquire about what is below this reactivity so that this real shift can occur. So, what is this reactivity trying to protect? What is the tenderness and vulnerability that is fueling the defensive patterning that's happening? So for many of us growing up, at some point, our softer or more tender feelings like being hurt or upset or afraid or just feeling confused or insecure, often those were not fully acknowledged, or they were even actively dismissed or minimized or even ridiculed by the adults in our lives. And for even those of you who, identify as being raised in very loving families, there were probably still times when your more tender emotions were not fully allowed or not fully attuned to. And then, regardless of our family of origin, we're all living in a culture that tells us that being sensitive and being vulnerable is equated to being weak. Now, of course, I know that story isn't true. I think the work of people like Brene Brown are doing amazing work around sort of rewriting this story and narrative about what vulnerability really is. But for the most part, we do still live in a culture that tells us vulnerability, being sensitive, means that we are weak. And so, intentionally or not, we then wind up training ourselves to swallow our tears, to toughen up, to take control of ourselves, to hide our feelings from others, and even hide our feelings from ourselves. Because if our tender feelings are not welcome, then actually allowing ourselves to have them would be a threat. It would be a threat to our social survival. Right? A threat to maybe functioning in our family or being accepted at school, or a threat to being respected and valued at work. So sometimes these feelings themselves become the threat because, again, they threaten our social survival, so much so that we have them and then they automatically can activate the fight, flight, or freeze survival response in order to protect us. And this happens so quickly and automatically that we're not often even aware that these vulnerable feelings are there that's initiating all of this. So we need to train ourselves to turn towards our vulnerability and start seeing how underneath the reactive expression is a vulnerable self. And when you connect with that and allow this, you gain the power to change the dynamic at play. You move into choice. So if there's one thing you take away from this talk, I want it to be, when in reactivity, turn towards your vulnerability. And that is where we are headed next. Okay, so to return to the exercise, part 2, and you can settle in again, whether that's just taking a breath or two, closing your eyes. And I want you to bring back the situation as best as you can to where you got triggered. So what happened? And then shifting into seeing how you got reactive. Right? How are you acting, speaking, behaving in ways that were reactive instead of responsive? And now I want you to let that reactivity actually get bigger. So sometimes, though, if you were in freeze, you might want to imagine instead that you were able to fight or flee. Right? Whatever is going to be sort of the medicine for this situation, allow that reactivity to get really big, as if you were able to fully express it. Right? Without the negative consequences of this happening in real life. So you can exaggerate it, let it get big. Some people imagine samurai swords, they go anime with it, they imagine exploding things, turning into the Hulk. Whatever works for you is fine. But just in this moment, give yourself permission to go for it. So for just a few more seconds, keep allowing your reactivity to fully expel itself, to fully air itself out. And if you feel like you need more time to visualize that, you can just pause this and then press play when you're ready. But what we'll do now is shift. So now that this reactivity got to express itself, what else is there? Right? What tenderness is there? So is there a part of you that felt afraid or hurt, insecure, confused, alone? There might have been a longing for something, a desire for something that's even vulnerable to allow or admit. But in this moment, whatever it is, allow yourself to feel that more tender emotion. Allow those feelings to be there. You can tune into where you feel them in your body. And what was it about this situation that was threatening to this tender, more vulnerable aspect of yourself? And if it feels helpful, you can give a name to this part of you. So you could just call it your vulnerable part, or you could just call it, this is my fear or my hurt. But sometimes it feels like a younger part, like a version of the child. Or I've had someone call it the invisible man, or their wilted flower. So if there's any name that feels right to you, go ahead. If not, don't worry. But either way, we're going to do some tending to this tender, vulnerable part. So first, just ask it, what was it needing? Right? What was it really wanting or needing in this situation that you're working with? So maybe it was needing safety or connection or love, maybe to be seen or to know that you matter. And it's not so much the thing that you needed somebody else to do, but we're sort of getting at a quality here, a value, a need that's deeper than just the actions of somebody else. And now that you identified what was being needed, I want you to imagine that you're able to receive it right now. So you can imagine that you yourself, as the one who's listening to this, you're able to give it to this part of you. Whatever that quality is, whatever that value or need is. If you have any difficulty imagining yourself giving it, you can recruit someone in your life who's been a support, a loved one, a friend, maybe someone who's passed, that they can help you give this more vulnerable part of you what it was really needing. Sometimes people also like to imagine more mythical or angelic archetypes are helping, giving, or aspects of nature. Like imagine that the sunlight is coming and giving what you need, or you're connecting to the earth or a tree and the roots are giving you what you need, or the ocean. Whatever works best for you, there's no right way. It's just whatever your system is best able to receive. So just take a moment and imagine that this vulnerable part of you is really getting what it needed. And imagine that that quality is coming alive in your body right now. Feel it fill you up. Feel it both penetrate, sort of saturate, sort of deep into your bones, and your cells are being filled with this quality or these values or needs, as well as even radiating out beyond you. And just do that for another few seconds, and even enjoy what that feels like to feel alive with this thing that you've so been longing for. And then come out of that experience or open your eyes when you're ready. And if you're working with a partner or you're writing with yourself, you can pause this and just share or write down what you learned about this vulnerable self. What was it really wanting? And what was it like to just take the first few steps at receiving it? So you might not have been able to fully receive it. That's okay. Even just an inch, a fraction of receiving it is good. And so lastly now, we want to respond. We're going to move into the third part, which is our responsiveness. We want to redirect our reactivity into a more preferred response. And when I use the word preferred, I mean a response to our situation, to yourself, or to others that is in alignment with your better values and intentions. So I see this as a response that is more relational instead of individualistic, usually more collaborative instead of competitive, and usually more caring and respectful, whether that's to yourself as well as to others, instead of being more critical and blameful. So for this next part, it's also going to be a two-parter, but in the first part of it, we're going to step away from the moment where you were triggered that we've been working on, and I want you instead to think right now about a time when you responded well. So it could be big or small, but a time that you look back on and you really feel good about how you showed up, right? So it could be a moment when you normally maybe would have gotten triggered, but instead you didn't, and you were able to respond. It could be a moment in life when you faced a challenge or got through a difficult situation. Or it could just be even a moment where you let someone go in front of you in traffic, right? Which might be something that you normally wouldn't do, right? So big or small, but you're picking right now a moment that you look back on and you would say, oh, this was a preferred expression of me. This is a version of me that exemplifies sort of the best of how I want to be showing up and relating to others in the world or to myself. So right now, tune in as we have been and bring to mind this moment. So where were you? What was happening? What were you doing that felt like it was this preferred expression of you? How are you relating to others or to the challenge at hand? And as you remember that, even feel it in your body right now. So, what sensations do you feel now as you recall this positive moment of being responsive? What feelings are there? What was your mind like? What's the quality of your mind? Or the stories that now are present, the beliefs or intentions that are present when you were in this moment? What values were present or in the forefront of your experience when you were expressing yourself in this way? And what skills or strengths that you have available to you, what skills or strengths were you using in that moment? And if you want, give this part of you a name. What would you call it? And so keep this preferred responsive self with you, and you're going to walk it over to this situation we've been working through where you got triggered. So walk this self over to that triggered moment. And what would this version of you do? So imagine that instead of going into the reactivity as you did, you were able to respond in the way that this preferred self would. And what do you see? How would this responsive self do things differently? What would be motivating it? Or what intentions would it be holding? What new or different interpretations about the situation would it have? What skills of yours would it be remembering to apply? And as you see a different scenario play out, I want you to ask this responsive self, how can it be more available to you when you need it most? So what are the ways that it can become more in the driver's seat of your experiences? Right, so what are the things that you can do when you're not triggered that will help you better anchor this responsive self in your way of being? And when you're ready, just open your eyes. And if you want to pause and share with a partner about what you learned from this responsive self or write that down, go ahead and pause. But to debrief, we just got to experience these three different expressions of self: a reactive self, a more vulnerable self, and a responsive self. And you got to see how each of these expressions holds a different perspective, right? They each have a different set of values and motivations. And then the consequences of responding from each of them are going to be very different as well. And so the more clearly that you see these different dimensions of yourself, the better you will get at distinguishing which one of these selves you are behaving or speaking from in any given moment, which then builds your capacity to choose which expression of self that you want to be aligning with and showing up as. Right? So my hope is that it's not about getting hung up on the ways that you've been reactive thus far, right? Because we all have, right? But instead that you're able to feel encouraged, maybe even excited about what is possible moving forward. Because if you had any ability, even the slightest ability, to experience these different expressions of yourself today in the exercise, then they are available for you to access again. And the more that you strengthen and repeat your relationship with that vulnerable self and your responsive self, the faster and easier it will get for you to access them when you need them more. All right, so to recap, we are wired to interpret non-life-threatening situations as if they were actual threats to our survival, which sets us up to get easily triggered and reactive in our relationships. But when we know our reactivity and we train ourselves to turn towards our vulnerability, our triggers become an opportunity and even a gift. So thank you all. I appreciate you going on the beginning of this journey with me. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, you can visit my website at jessicaferncooley.com. You can email me at info@jessicaferncooley.com. And I hope this was helpful and supportive to you today. And what I do when I work with clients, we go through that responsive arc. We really learn about what it is to get better at noticing and naming that you're triggered, which is probably 60-70% of this work, then knowing how to stop and soothe yourself. So stopping that reactivity, whether that's the cycle of reactivity within a dyad or the contagion that happens with multiple partners, soothing yourself, and then how you do this connecting with the vulnerability and then redirecting into responsiveness. So noticing and naming, stopping and soothing, and connecting and redirecting. All right, good luck to you all. Take care. Thank you.